What I'd like to do this morning is spend a little bit of time outlining the al-Qaeda threat to the U.S. homeland, both in terms of rural areas as well as in urban centers, because as we look back at the last several decades, what we see, I would say, is this is not just a urban metropolitan problem. This also hits rural homeland America. What I want to do in general is first acknowledge that there obviously are lots of threats in the U.S. homeland. There are a range of, we face pandemics, we face homegrown threats, we face criminal organizations, the cyber dimension. Again, if you followed the news recently on the cyber attacks, both to U.S. government agencies and companies, including from states like China, there is clearly, and there's a new national intelligence estimate on this, that's obviously a major threat. If there were to be a war with Iran, whether it was an Israeli or a U.S.-Israeli, that would obviously create threats from organizations like Hezbollah. But I'm going to focus in particular this morning on one component of the threat, not to argue that this is necessarily the most important, but this is a component and something that, as I'll argue, is part of one way of thinking about this is in the late 1940s, the U.S. faced the beginnings of a threat in a series of decades-long struggle with the Soviet Union, which we call the Cold War. I think we're probably about halfway, hard to gauge it in time perspectives, but we're probably 2 decades into a generation-long struggle with extremist radical groups. And as you'll see in this presentation, I think part of what we're seeing is the emergence over the last year or two of what I'll call a fourth wave of activity now in the Levant, especially in Syria and in North Africa. So from a homeland perspective, we sometimes will sit back and say, well, we haven't been hit since 2001. I'm going to push back a little bit today in several ways. One is we've come very close several times. Very close several times in the past 2 or 3 years in several respects that I'll go over. Second, if you look at the last several months, we've had a U.S. ambassador killed in Libya. We've had U.S. citizens killed in Algeria. We just had a suicide attack at a U.S. embassy in Turkey. And what we see, I think, when we look over the last several decades is targeting the homeland comes in a series of waves. I think we're at a point now where we're seeing a growth of jihadist activity in certain areas. The concern is, if you look a little bit farther down the road, that at some point that may come back around into the U.S. homeland. And I'll go through that in a little more detail. But let me just first start by saying that if you have, I'm happy to treat this more like a class discussion than a sermon up here. So feel free to raise your hands as we move along, and I'm happy to take questions or comments again as we go along, rather than sort of waiting till the end. So again, feel free to raise your hand and stop me over the next hour or so. So what's the agenda? Again, as I said earlier, we haven't been hit with a major attack from al-Qaeda, and I'll define the organization because it's very different from what it was in 2001 when we were hit in New York City, the plane that went down to Pennsylvania, and then in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. But if you look at the last, say, 3 years, again, pushing aside the attacks against U.S. installations overseas in the last several months, we had cargo planes plot based out of Yemen that came close. We had Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, the underwear bomber, also coming from Yemen, that nearly took down an airline coming into Detroit. Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, actually got the bomb into New York City. Luckily, he had not spent enough time training in Pakistan, where he had conducted training with the Pakistan Taliban. The Alexandria Five, not far from my house, who radicalized in the United States. including using the internet, which, as we'll go on a little bit, one of the interesting things about social media, well, we talk often about sort of the cyber attacks, including from countries like China. But I'll tell you, the jihadist forums online, which have radicalized individuals in multiple locations, have become, anybody who spends time looking through a lot of these jihadist websites, they are burgeoning now. Twitter, YouTube, MySpace, just internet forums in general, they're quite active on multiple fronts. And even over the last several weeks and months, with attacks against U.S. officials and citizens overseas, have been burgeoning. Najibullah Zazi, that was a core al-Qaeda plot against New York City, very serious. Went back to al-Qaeda senior leadership in Pakistan, and then the airlines plot from the UK, directed taking down airlines headed from Heathrow to both Canada and the United States. Give you kind of a flavor that we've come close. In some cases, it's been good U.S. intelligence and good law enforcement activities. In the Zazi case, it was clearly effective U.S. signals intelligence collection, as well as good FBI and local law enforcement in the Denver area, as well as back in New York City. And that's part of the point that I'd like to get across today, is even with the al-Qaeda and its evolving organization today, in plots that we've seen, including the Zazi one here, they are not just directed at metropolitan urban areas. I was in Aurora 2 days ago in Colorado, just outside of Denver. Zazi built his bombs in suburban Colorado, and he was bringing them to conduct attacks that were very similar to the London attacks that were successful on 7/7 in 2005, backpacks, bags in 3 different subway cars in New York City. But he built his bomb specifically in suburban areas, in suburban and rural areas of Colorado, so that he would elude detection from U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies. So again, this is not just an urban phenomena of where the target areas are. It's also one of rural ones too. I mean, even in cases here like Faisal Shahzad, he built his bomb in Connecticut, not in New York City, which was his target area. So again, this is more than just an urban phenomenon. U.S. intelligence estimates about al-Qaeda and its affiliates, as I'll walk through in a moment, have definitely evolved. For a while in the 2011 and 12 period, there was a lot of upbeat assessments that al-Qaeda was on the verge of strategic defeat, that was on the ropes. But I'll say that the assessments have been changing over the last several months because of the activity we have seen in countries like Syria, where al-Qaeda's affiliate, the al-Nusra Front, has become involved in establishing more control of territory and then reaching nodes out of Syria into Europe and then the United States. So again, we've seen an increase in weapons, including man-pads, heavy weapons, a wish to expand its activity outside of the region and pursue global attacks. It's got funding, it's got money, it's got fighters. So I think, we're seeing, as I'll talk about in a moment, a reemergence in some areas that we've got to watch very carefully and that have direct impacts to a homeland security perspective. Let me start off, though, by asking, who and what is al-Qaeda, and what does that mean for homeland security? Because there are a range of different views on this, and I'll give you my perspective. And I'd like to give you a sense historically that when you look at this organization's activities, we saw a first wave of activity which directly hit the homeland. That was in 2001. It was preceded by attacks where? In U.S. embassies in Africa, against Tanzania and in Kenya. So U.S. embassies were targeted there. There was little response. If you remember at that time, in 1998 and in 1999, there was limited response back in some missiles struck in camps in places like Afghanistan, but not a lot of targeted attacks against the leadership structure. So by 2001, 3 years after the embassy bombings, al-Qaeda hit the U.S. homeland. It had built up its infrastructure globally, a little more globally, and from its base in Afghanistan with cells in multiple locations targeted the U.S. homeland. That organization was hit very hard in 2002 and 3 and 4, especially on the homeland, with very effective efforts by your agencies. A lot of people captured in the U.S., a lot of good work done in trying to increase the difficulty of getting back into the U.S. on airplanes, so airport security improved. And when I went through the bin Laden documents after his capture when I was at U.S. Special Operations Command, it was interesting because it was one of the few cases where we've had very specific information from al-Qaeda senior leaders talking not to us, because you can often watch their video linkages where Ayman al-Zawahiri will, or bin Laden when he was alive, would speak to the U.S. President in some cases before elections. This was speaking to each other. What was interesting is Zawahiri, who's the al-Qaeda #1, and a range of current al-Qaeda officials said very specifically in 2009 and 10 and 11, up through the death of bin Laden, that the U.S. had become a much more difficult place to penetrate. That the efforts to crack down and improve homeland security in the United States had definitely impacted their ability to conduct attacks in the U.S. homeland. I mean, there is no better evidence, I think, than from captured al-Qaeda documents that you folks in general in your agencies have done a very good job of trying to reduce vulnerabilities in the homeland. No better evidence than coming from al-Qaeda's inner documents. So, again, kudos to your agencies for, I think, what has been successful. Now, that first wave and the successes in those early years was followed by what you might call a second wave, and that really led. It was followed by the, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. A lot of al-Qaeda activity and resurgence, including targeting the U.S. There was an increased wave of plots. We saw the Madrid attacks, which did have al-Qaeda involvement in 2004. 2005 was London, so a major U.S. ally. They successfully targeted the tube and one bus in London, but devastating attack. And then al-Qaeda in Iraq by about 2006 was significantly weakened by activities both in the U.S. And overseas. The third wave, which began in around 2007 and 8 and 2009, with a base in Yemen, and we saw efforts by al-Qaeda to try and target the U.S. homeland from Yemen. And as I'll show you in a minute, examples of how they tried to do it. We're probably, I would say now, in the midst of what I'd call a fourth wave of activity. And so the threat streams that U.S. intelligence agencies are looking at are now coming increasingly from North Africa and the Levant, Syria in particular, but also Lebanon, in a revitalized al-Qaeda in Iraq. Despite the fact that the U.S. has left, al-Qaeda attacks in Iraq have doubled from levels from last year. Again, notable concern. So part of this issue is looking at connections. We've got some former CHDS students in places like Egypt right now, some FBI folks, classmates of yours in places like Cairo, who I've spoken with recently, have been very concerned about the growth of al-Qaeda affiliates in places, again, like Egypt. I'll walk through some of that in a little bit more detail. But let me give you a sense of, from a homeland security perspective, the organization we're dealing with, because it's very different from what we saw in 2001 when we were hit in New York City, Washington, and the plane in Pennsylvania. I'm going to break it down into several areas. One is, what are the strategic goals of this organization? Where does the U.S. homeland, both our urban and our rural areas, where do they fit in? Second, what's the organizational structure look like? And how does it compare to what we saw back in 2001? Because, again, what we're seeing is a very different kind of organization. Some of the groups we'll talk about in a moment don't present much of a threat, at least at this point, to the U.S. homeland, and some do. We'll also talk about what's the geographic scope look like today, and how much of this, is and will likely impact the U.S. homeland. And then we'll also look briefly at attack patterns and how those have evolved. Because what we're seeing, again, from a Homeland Security perspective, is increasing sophistication. If you look at the attacks in Syria right now, of improvised explosive devices, suicide attacks, again, things that we've seen migrate from theater to theater and could certainly be migrated to the U.S. homeland. The effectiveness and the ability to share that information online is quite impressive in many ways. If I start with the goals of the organization, and where does the U.S. homeland sit? I'm going to break this into two parts. If you look at al-Qaeda's current leader today, who sits likely in Pakistan, Ayman al-Zawahiri, his goal, I would say, based on both his writings and any of the information collected on him today indicates, is that group, however difficult this may be, still wants to establish a caliphate that spans North Africa, again, where we're seeing a lot of activity, the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant up in Syria and Turkey, through South Asia, and then a much weaker element down in Indonesia and places like the Philippines and Thailand. Now, when you actually get down into some of the very specific groups, they may be more parochial. They may be more interested in Sharia law in Libya or Syria or Turkey rather than across this great expanse. The core elements of the group, I would say, are still looking at trying to overthrow regimes in this area, which is why, again, when we take a broader look at the kinds of militant groups that exist, they're spread out very specifically in areas that they can achieve this over the long run. They won't get there, but this is their long-term goal. So where do we fit in today? The U.S. predominantly fits into this vision because it is the backer of many of the regimes that it is trying to overthrow. If you look at U.S. support, including development assistance to Libya, U.S. and French support to Mali, though the U.S. hasn't provided weapons to the Syrian opposition, it is providing plenty of non-lethal aid. U.S. still has forces in Afghanistan. It still supplies aid to Pakistan. It still has a small training mission in Iraq and still has aid to a range of regimes in this area. So the U.S. does remain a major target, the major foreign target, what we call the far enemy of al-Qaeda and a range of its local groups because of the support that it provides to regimes that it's trying to overthrow. Second, sad as this may still seem, the U.S. is still viewed as an infidel regime because of its support to Israel, because it is still predominantly a non-Muslim state. It is still predominantly Christian and Jewish, though it does have an increasingly larger Muslim population. It is still viewed as an infidel state. So for a range of ideological reasons as well as support to regimes in this area, the U.S. will remain the major target of al-Qaeda and its affiliates' activities over the next several years. And so that impacts both the threat to the U.S. homeland, and we've heard Zawahiri say recently that he would still, and I saw this when I read through a lot of the bin Laden documents, they would still very much like to pull off several attacks in the U.S. homeland. And it's interesting, when you read through Zawahiri's works and some of the internal al-Qaeda memorandums and letters, you know, they are thinking creatively. The group in Yemen has been thinking about how to find ways to get through security at airports through implanting devices inside bodies that make it more difficult to find on airport scanners. They've been looking at ways to come up through the U.S.-Mexican border by using current human trafficking and drug trafficking lines. So thinking very systematically about how to penetrate the United States to conduct attacks in multiple locations. Again, this is not just places like New York City and Washington. I want to move for a second to the structure, because this gives us a sense of what we're dealing with now. If you go back to 2001, the organization was very hierarchically structured, and we talked about this in our classes here. Led by bin Laden, with a structure that was based, you see the bottom of the screen, specific committees that dealt with military, finance, media, political committees, religious committees, security committees. On the plotting activities, a lot of it was directly coming from here. Both Afghanistan first, and then once the U.S. helped overthrow the Taliban regime from Pakistan. So if you look at a lot of the plotting, even in the 04, 05, 06 period, directed at the U.S. homeland, and even through 2009, Zazi plot, New York City, the Shahzad plot, again, New York City, those plots were coming orchestrated out of the senior leadership level. The handlers would often get pushed down. So Rashid Rauf, who was involved in, or Adnan Shukr Juma, who was involved in some of the plotting in 2009, got pushed down several levels, but it had a fairly centralized organizational structure. I mean, that is clearly different now. I think despite the administration's correct argument that al-Qaeda has been weakened in Pakistan right now, it still has a central node that is able to communicate with the field. It's much more difficult to do that because of the U.S. pressure from strikes, which caused a lot of difficulties in communicating. They don't communicate a lot with each other using technical means just because they have been hit so many times with drone strikes because of U.S. collection capabilities. So, but there still is an element, still survived. Ayman al-Zawahiri is still alive. He was there at the founding in 1988, and he's still alive. This organization is not dead. It has been wounded in this area. But what we've seen is the growth of this sort of next box of affiliated groups. We've got branches we still have in Iraq. Their attack trends have gone up this year. U.S. is not there anymore, at least in a major military presence. Al-Qaeda attacks, even if you've seen the newspapers in the last 2 or 3 days, they've gone up. They're targeting Shia, among others. We're seeing growing concerns about Al-Qaeda activities more regionally, and the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Matt Olson, noted in testimony several months ago that also seeing increasing concerns about Al-Qaeda in Iraq activities and plotting back to the U.S. homeland. So again, we're seeing the attack patterns growing in Iraq right now from AQI. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen has been weakened somewhat, but key bomb makers, Ibrahim al-Asiri, who's the bomb maker for the underwear bomber in Detroit, for the cargo planes plot that we saw in 2011, and then some more recent activity, still alive, in Yemen right now, has not been effectively targeted. We're seeing, interestingly, we're seeing growth of several affiliates. Some of our CHDS former students have noted in Egypt right now that Al-Qaeda in Egypt has petitioned for formal affiliate status, so we're seeing a sense of a growth industry, at least in Egypt, as well as in North Africa. I'll come back to those in a moment. There are still a number of groups that work with Al-Qaeda occasionally. And again, this is an area that we're seeing some grayness, increasing grayness. Al-Qaeda, and when I go through the Benghazi attack in a moment, I'll show you what this looks like. But Al-Qaeda will conduct attacks overseas, including against U.S. targets, with other organizations. These aren't formal affiliates. These leaders of these organizations haven't sworn loyalty or bayat to Al-Qaeda, but they will often act in cooperation with them in several areas. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. Guys like David Headley, more like an informal network. He was not a member of a group. He was actually involved in multiple groups, but again, we're seeing a range of allied networks. And then of potential concern in the U.S. is simply inspired networks. I would venture to say, not out of the question over the next year, that we were to see the Israelis, for example, conduct limited strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. I tell you, that would send the radicalization jihadist forums through the roof. You'd see a lot of activity trying to inspire individuals in the United States to conduct retaliatory strikes for, I think, what would be viewed as a, in their words, Zionist crusader attack against the Muslim state. I mean, Iran's Shia, not Sunni, but that's, I think, where we'd see the propaganda. So, again, take this as a warning over the next year. Were you to see an increase in U.S. or even Israeli tension with Iran, especially one that surfaced in the sense of conflict, I think we'd have a lot of Homeland Security questions, not just about Hezbollah activities in Shia areas in the United States, but also the recruitment network from Sunnis and radicalized individuals in the United States. And again, if you look historically, the war and the conflict in both Afghanistan and Iraq have been excellent radicalization tools and instruments for al-Qaeda and a range of extremist organizations. So that's coming down the pike, maybe this year, maybe not, but certainly not out of the question. Turning again to this central component, just to touch on it, again, I would argue that this organization is still, as much as I wish it was dead, is still alive. Zawahiri is still its leader. He's Egyptian. The head of external operations, Abdel-Rahman al-Sharqi, still alive. Abu Zaid al-Kuwaiti, religious committee. Hamza al-Ghamdi, the top facilitator, Saudi. Abdel-Rahman al-Maghrebi, who's really the number 2 right now. Coming out of the media committee is Moroccan. So they include many Arabs, but also an increasing number of Pakistanis. Because that's where they're located right now in Pakistan. Now, remember, what's interesting from a homeland perspective is what al-Qaeda has viewed after the attacks against the U.S. consulate in Libya, after the U.S. The attack against U.S. citizens in Algeria, is there has been very little response against the networks involved in those attacks. The individuals that were involved in the Libya attack against the U.S. ambassador that killed him, the individuals involved in killing American citizens in Algeria have not been captured, have not been punished. And I would say what we're seeing right now is a sense that the Americans are vulnerable. They've left Iraq. They're leaving Afghanistan. We've gotten away with attacks, and now in multiple locations, it is time for the homeland. So, again, it's almost this. They have not been effectively targeted after some of these attacks, which I would say they have taken as a sign of U.S. weakness. That's my interpretation of it. So I would say, again, that raises concerns. Now, the level of plotting we're seeing from Pakistan right now against the U.S. homeland is definitely less than it was, say, in 2009 or 10. But, we'll see whether this resurges. Again, if you go back to that map of al-Qaeda activity and the waves that I talked about earlier, the level of plotting against the U.S. homeland has come in waves. It was pretty serious in 98, 99, 2000, 2001, went down in 2003 and 4, went up again in 05, 06, came down again in 2007 and 8, went up again in 2009 and 10. It's come down a little bit, but based on the trajectory of activity overseas, I would say it looks like it will probably 2013 and 14 come back up again. Whether they're successful is a different story, but there is certainly an interest. We're also seeing, variations in success of its affiliates overseas. So the Iraq contingent, as I noted earlier, we're seeing a growth of activity in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, again, I'll come back to them in a second. Growth of activity in North Africa, in part because of the Arab Spring. In an ideal world, what we've seen in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, the overthrow of dictatorial leaders, dictatorships, authoritarian regimes is a good thing in general. And the replacement of democratic elections in many of these countries, it's a good thing for America. People can choose their leadership. But the reality, now that we're probably 2 years into the Arab uprisings, is so far anyway, what I would argue they've done is they have significantly weakened governments in these areas. Libya, the government controls the capital and a couple of major cities, but has lost control of most of the countryside. In Egypt, you have a government that has been willing to release several al-Qaeda leaders, including the brother of al-Qaeda's #1 right now, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was released from prison and has not come back. In Syria, there is an active insurgency, which I'll come back to in a moment. The prospects then for the ability to use those bases to come back to the homeland is something that needs to be watched very carefully. Now, I'll go through these areas in a little bit more detail and tie them back to the U.S. homeland, both urban and rural areas, in a moment. But I'd say these areas are something to watch very carefully. And then obviously we have a range of groups that are allied that may conduct attacks with them in a range of areas, including Lashkar-e-Taiba. You see that up here. So the organization has, I would say, become a lot more decentralized. Very centralized structure that existed in 2001, much more decentralized today. So if someone were to ask, well, how important is the Pakistan central node, and how much concern is that organization to the homeland? I would say it's weakened right now. The level of plotting directed at the homeland right now is definitely less than 2 or 3 years ago. But we're also seeing, with a decentralized organization, we're also seeing a growing willingness of the Yemen contingent to continue to target the homeland. We're seeing a willingness of the Syrian contingent now to expand its global networks in Iraq, which is closely linked to Syria. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center, again, has expressed growing concern about nodes back into the United States. And I would say in North Africa, for the moment, what we're seeing is not an interest in targeting the U.S. homeland at the moment, but is an interest in targeting U.S. citizens and government agencies in those areas, including embassies and U.S. citizens working at gas installations in other locations. So if you actually look at the scope of activity, what does this organization look like geographically? In 2001, the organization that struck us in the homeland was predominantly focused in southern Afghanistan, where bin Laden was active, and had cells in other places. But for those of you who keep hearing from news media sources or even from government officials that the organization is dead, when you skip from 2001 and a series of cells overseas to the scope of the core in Pakistan that's weakened to some degree, the affiliates in Somalia and Yemen and Iraq and North Africa, to the allies, again, the nodes in the Levant, including Syria and North Africa, including populations back in U.S. rural and urban areas, is of definite concern. The Syrian front definitely has nodes of back in U.S. communities. People that are fundraising. We've had people leave the U.S. to go fight in Syria. Concern is them coming back at some point. I mean, Syria, by the way, Syria is now probably the most significant jihadist fight going on right now for many of these groups, without a doubt. What we have seen in their fundraising activities is stunning. They have gotten a lot of money from communities, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere, including the Gulf. They've gotten a lot of weapons. They've gotten a lot of fighters that have moved to the Syria front from other areas. And so this is why, as you see these debates happening in the media about U.S. officials debating whether to arm the Syrian opposition, frankly, the challenge from a U.S. Homeland Security standpoint is you start providing weapons to a pretty fractured insurgency in Syria, which has a growing al-Qaeda contingent called Al-Nusra Front. That is their cover name, but to be frank, they are an al-Qaeda organization. Part of the question is whether they're more of an affiliate or they're a sub-branch of al-Qaeda in Iraq. They are an al-Qaeda organization. They are involved in a lot of attacks. They have perfected a lot of the kinds of attacks we get concerned about in the U.S., vehicle kinds of bombs, suicide attacks, and big ones. So, again, we've got a contingent that still exists in Iran that looks like it may be trying to get out. A contingent that is involved in Lebanon. And so, again, the issue, I would say, for us in the U.S. homeland is also to monitor they make heavy use of the diaspora populations in U.S. urban and rural areas. for these very same reasons of fundraising, just general communication, information, propaganda, and a range of other reasons. So again, the issue from a Homeland Security perspective is attaching these areas up on the screen, these groups, to their diaspora populations and sympathizers in the U.S. And some of these aren't just diaspora populations. Some of these are also individuals that have converted to Islam, a radical version of Islam, from other religions in the U.S. who are generally agnostic. There have been some very disturbing converts in multiple American cities and rural areas, and who have agreed to participate in jihadist fights from the U.S. to these areas. So again, the scope, though, is of concern, not trending necessarily in the right direction. This is why I would say, just to go back and forth, this is why I would say we are in the midst, I would argue, of a decades-long struggle against radical Islamic organizations. And this really and I'm talking here mostly about al-Qaeda organizations. And as I said earlier, there are plenty of threats that we deal with, from pandemics to homegrowns, to environmental groups, to concerns about Hezbollah activities and others. But this is one key issue. And again, when we go from a pretty small geographic scope in 2001 to a much broader global scope in 2013, this problem is not going away. We've got dead ambassadors and dead U.S. citizens the past couple of months in several of these locations, and I guarantee you they do want to hit the U.S. homeland. Zawahiri wants almost nothing more than revenge, going back to Glenn's comment earlier, for the death of several of his colleagues and friends from U.S. drone strikes in places like Pakistan. Here's the Headley example, and just to touch on this again, this organization has become a lot more diffuse. Headley, obviously, from Chicago. So again, Homeland, United States, was involved in running a front company. And the way he did this, just to be clear, is he was running what looked like a legitimate front company from Chicago in India that was in the business of visas and helping people with travel documents, and he was running an international terrorist operation from his home on the north side of Chicago, not far from actually where I used to live. And you know what's interesting here is local law enforcement in Chicago, police agencies, and the FBI and U.S. intelligence agencies knew nothing about him. The tip, actually, the key tip for Headley came from another country, came from an ally. He was operating completely under the radar of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies from Chicago. We knew nothing about him. Zazi, before he came close to his attempted attack in New York City, was operating entirely under the radar screen, as was Faisal Shahzad, until he put his bomb in Times Square, operating totally under the radar screen. So, and you know what I've said before to many of you, that the challenge we have, I think, in working with our communities, if you look at the Zazi case, this is from the prosecution. What's troubling to me is why Zazi, who was building his bomb from Colorado, okay, even though he was going to attack New York City, he was watching jihadist videos in his uncle's condo in Colorado. He was mixing ingredients in several locations. One of them was a house. He had family that had seen him watching videos, had seen him mixing these ingredients, but nobody went to local officials or private organizations and provided information that somebody was up to no good. So the question that I think we've got to ask ourselves is, are we doing in all of the areas we're operating in, are we doing a good enough job of reaching out and knowing our communities? If what we're getting in some places is people just simply not willing to provide information on direct attacks in the U.S. homeland. Again, the Zazi plot was not found, even though his family was aware of what he was doing, was found with a signals collection. It was a signals collection intercept, not anybody in the Aurora area, even those people who knew about him. So again, the question I'd say to us is, are we in all cases, do we know our communities well enough, and do they trust us enough to alert potential terrorist activity that's going on in those areas? In several of these cases, the answer is no. We do not know our communities well enough. They do not trust us in all cases. Now, some of you have much better contacts, and again, this is not about this is not about snitching. This is about protecting lives. These are people that are attacking Americans, just like them. And so part of it is, I think, figuring out how to better work with our communities in these areas. If you go to the Benghazi case, which you've heard about, what's interesting there in the state of al-Qaeda, again, this was the killing of an American ambassador overseas. But again, with concerns that this group is looking towards the U.S. homeland now. What's interesting is the attack itself. I was actually in Afghanistan when this attack occurred. This is the September 11th, 2012 attack. This was perpetrated by several organizations, and the way it again transpired. So the news media coverage of this has been pretty bad and pretty politicized. But the way this generally happened is with some of the riots happening in North Africa after the Islamic video that came out on YouTube, when especially the riots in Egypt happened and the U.S. embassy in Cairo was at least initially breached, there was a quick discussion among individuals from 3 separate organizations in Libya, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Ansar al-Sharia, and then a group from Egypt called the Muhammad Jamal Network. Had a quick conversation on September 10th and especially September 11th on targeting the U.S. consulate in Benghazi and conducting a quick attack against Americans. Now, in this case, was it an al-Qaeda attack? Well, there were some al-Qaeda operatives involved. Did the core plan it? No. Did the core of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb plan it? No. It was some networks coming together very quickly to conduct an attack. That's the complexity I think we're seeing now, both in the homeland plotting and in the activity we're seeing in targeting U.S. interests overseas, is groups of individuals that have gone to training camps together, groups of individuals that have communicated with each other over the internet and in jihadist forums, coming together for very specific attacks like Benghazi. Again, this led to a dead American ambassador. The last one, if anybody can remember, I think was the U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan that was killed. So a big deal, and I think a sign that North Africa, with the Arab uprisings, has become an area that has been somewhat conducive to a rebirth of this organization. What I'd like to do is walk through some of the key affiliates and bring this also back to the homeland, and so connect what we're seeing in each of these theaters with al-Qaeda back here in the U.S. heartland, both in urban areas, our cities, as well as in rural parts of the country. So if you start off with Yemen, Yemen's clearly an area where we've seen al-Qaeda activity south. If you look at the map here, along the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden, this is still probably the area where we see the most active plotting against the U.S. homeland. Again, as I said earlier, individuals like Ibrahim al-Asiri, the chief bomb maker from al-Qaeda's Yemen contingent, still alive, still looking to hit targets in the U.S., still looking, among other things, at airline attacks, and still looking at attacks that would try to get through American security. And if you go back about a decade or so, it is worth noting, and Asiri has talked about, in some cases, the evolution of the attack plotting against the U.S. homeland. It's worth appreciating, if that's the right word, their strategy, which is back in 2001, at least on the airline security plotting, the U.S. took security precautions after 9/11 to limit things like box cutters and knives on airplanes. So by December, what's the next step? It's Richard Reed with a shoe bomb. So we make you take off shoes when you go through metal detectors now in airports. So what does Al Qaeda come back with in 2005? Well, it's the liquid plot from the bombers in the UK. It's to bring in liquid explosives on Lucozade and Oasis bottles, essentially Gatorade bottles, and then to put those bombs together either in the airport or on the airplane itself, because they can make it through security. So after we take measures to limit liquids and gels on airlines, they come back and say, okay, let's see if we can get bomb components together on without using metal, so they can make it through a metal detector. That's where you get the Ibrahim al-Asiri Yemen al-Qaeda plotters thinking about, okay, let's put an underwear bomb together that you can take a syringe, put some chemical ingredients together, get an initial detonation, and then a secondary one, and take down an airline. Now that bomb had worked in Yemen. Before he left, that bomb had worked in Yemen. So when Abdul Muttalib leaves Yemen here, cuts through Ghana, Nigeria, and then goes up through the Netherlands before he hits the United States, that bomb had worked. That bomb had worked on at least 2 occasions. Maybe the course of the 2 weeks or so of travel it took to get from Yemen on the 6th of December to the 25th of December, maybe that had made the mixture a little impure, that had impacted the explosives. But the issue now is to understand, look, they are trying to find ways to make it through U.S. detection systems. And so it's the evolution of trying to think 1 or 2 steps ahead that's worth considering. And so I would say from our standpoint, we have got to be looking 1, 2, 3 steps ahead at where they're going. Yeah.
You know, Seth, I'm glad you kind of brought up the airport security, because you look at what happened in Brussels. This is about a robbery. This wasn't sophisticated. This was dressing up like law enforcement, bursting through the gates, stealing $50 million worth of diamonds, and getting out in 3 minutes. And every day in all of the international airports, you get tons of thefts, you know, and other things by employees. So if we still are looking at trying to infiltrate as a passenger or something like that, as opposed to just getting a job, you know, with the airlines or other companies, or something as, you know, like with the diamonds, you know, are we really again we're focusing on the security based upon what they have done in the past, but the criminal natures go on all the time, and we just keep putting it on in its own little box. Oh, this is criminal, this is terrorist, and the two don't overlap, which we know is not true.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. And, you know, what's pretty clear, I think, in the Brussels case, too, is there was a lot of surveillance, reconnaissance, and intelligence collection that went into scoping out how that was going to be done, collecting information on the time sequencing of when the diamonds were going to be there. I mean, that's pretty good. That's worth monitoring. That's pretty good. That's pretty good intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And again, what's worth it is when somebody is motivated to penetrate the, whether it's in the U.S. homeland directly, or, you know, the Brussels airport is interesting because you can fly directly from Brussels to the U.S. Somebody's interested in penetrating the network for whatever means, whether it's terrorist activity or criminal nature. You know, it is worth noting these kinds of cases. How did they do it? Not just their motivation, but how did they do it? And how do we limit that stuff from happening again? Because, again, I think when you look at the way these organizations operate, they do have a learning process. So they will look at other lessons from criminal groups, state actions in trying to penetrate systems like airport security. So, yeah, I think there's no question that those the diamond, the Brussels diamond incident is definitely should be flagged. How did they do it? How'd they get in? How'd they collect? Any other questions? Okay, let me just move on. Just to summarize on the Yemen contingent, this is, again, probably the most serious threat we're facing to the U.S. homeland. You got an organization that has lost some of its leaders, but is still actively plotting against the U.S. homeland from Yemen. And again, actually, even after the Abdul Muttalib attack, they did try to get into they did try to get the cargo planes plot, you know, putting a printer cartridge, bombs on a printer cartridge and getting it, blowing up an airplane that way. So again, seeing innovation on their side, which means, again, just to that last point, we've got to be thinking about 2 or 3 steps ahead. But this is an area, again, of notable concern on the homeland front, the Yemen contingent. Even though, in general, al-Qaeda has actually lost some ground in Yemen through a combination of Yemeni activity and U.S. activity in that country. Dangerous organization, lost some ground, but still worth noting its nodes back into the U.S. homeland. Again, probably the most active of the affiliates in targeting the U.S. Again, transportation targets, especially airlines, seem to be their most significant focus, at least for the moment. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as I noted earlier, you know, one of the challenges is we've had a number of Iraqis that have moved to the U.S. As immigrants over the past several years because of the Iraq War. We're seeing efforts to try and infiltrate some of the immigration networks in the U.S. of Iraqis to conduct attacks, fundraising, and other activity in the U.S. from Iraqi diaspora populations. Yeah.
Seth, with the discussion about how the souls are distributed, and can you talk a little bit about our communication and intelligence network and how it's changed? I mean, they must be doing something in that realm, and it must be complicated in a distributed environment.
So the question is how has the communication intelligence collection business changed? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. How's it changed?
That's a good question. The communication, I have to be a little careful about how to answer this. On the communication front, I mean, the reason this organization or this broader network is more decentralized is they do have a tougher job communicating with each other. There still is some communication that comes through couriers. If you've seen Zero Dark 30, you know, that network was captured or was taken down in part because of identifying who the couriers are. So there is still a courier base that will provide communications from senior leaders out. But I'll tell you, a lot of the senior leaders have not used modern technology because they're concerned that it is being monitored. So there is on the communication front, what it's often become from the central node in Pakistan is video messages that they'll get out to Al Jazeera or other locations and broadcast statements from, say, Ayman al-Zawahiri to his brothers in Syria to support the jihad. So messages will come out through means other than human couriers or phone calls or emails. They'll come out through kind of ways that can be distributed quite easily either over the television or over the internet. Now, within the different nodes, and as you get further down from the core groups in all of the affiliate countries, Yemen, Iraq, etc., communication back to the homeland has, I would still say, is predominantly an electronic means, through emails, through jihadist chat rooms, through social media. Social media is probably the single most significantly used medium to communicate with already radicalized individuals in the U.S. or potential and hopeful individuals in the U.S. So that is the dominant communication medium to come back to the U.S. heartland is through communications. So the years, I think, of a lot of human radicalization that got Gadan or the Lackawanna group up in Buffalo, those days are maybe not entirely gone, but human radicalization is, especially if it's happening in the U.S., it's generally given way to communication and radicalization using social media. On the intelligence collection side, look, there's a lot of the same thing. We know through the bin Laden documents that they read leaked information. I was in Afghanistan in 2009 and 10 working for, among other individuals, General McChrystal. When that memo, the U.S. strategy was leaked to the media, the Washington Post published a redacted version of it. We now know that al-Qaeda actually took that document and made all these little notes about what the U.S. strategy was. They've read through Bob Woodward's books, including leaked, they've read through leaked articles in the press. So in terms of intelligence collection, they will definitely read U.S. media. They'll read U.S. discussions on issues. They will definitely use Google Earth and mapping and concerns about publicly available satellite technology. It was also worth noting that that what we've also seen a little bit on the communications front is, in some areas anyway, a little bit more technological savvy, finding ways to hide their communications. So if you look at Faisal Shahzad, these communications back to Pakistan were done in using ways to hide who he was talking with, increasing use of anonymizers, stuff that you can get off the shelf from commercially available locations. So again, the sophistication in some areas of hiding communications through electronic means, through hiding IP addresses or giving false ones, it's definitely changed from 10 years ago. Yeah. Are they doing anything with cyber? I would say, based on U.S. assessments, including stuff that's been printed in the media recently, the biggest efforts on the cyber attack front end up being states, like the Chinese or the Russians or others. So on the cyber attack front, I haven't seen a lot of information about groups like this, Al-Qaeda in particular, using cyber attacks. I mean, they'll talk about this, but is the level of sophistication as being that good for a cyber-style attack? I think what they've tried to do increasingly is use the cyber realm, again, for recruitment, for fundraising, for radicalizing, and for information and propaganda using social media. Not a lot for cyber attacks. The most sophisticated countries, if you read the New York Times piece on this either yesterday or 2 years ago, are countries. Countries with a lot of resources can pour money into education and train, pull out people from universities that conduct cyber kinds of attacks and espionage against the U.S. So I don't see a lot of evidence of significant cyber attack capabilities from jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda, but there clearly is a potential, I think, for that if they can get enough qualified people involved in doing it. Yeah.
What do you see as the risks and the benefits to both the U.S. Homeland Security enterprise as well as the Al-Qaeda and their networks for the recent acquisition of Al Gore's networks by Al Jazeera?
Of Al Gore's
communications networks by Al Jazeera.
It's funny. I haven't seen much. I haven't actually seen much. I haven't seen much on that. What is interesting, this is Al Jazeera's coverage of Al-Qaeda has definitely evolved over the last several years. There's been a lot of criticism coming from individuals on Al Jazeera of the sort of jihadist activity, especially killing of Muslims. So their coverage, I think, has definitely evolved. They were hardest on the U.S., I would say, in the early days of the Afghan, especially the Iraq War. I think their coverage has evolved. I'm not sure that's going to be, I haven't seen much evidence that they have been notably impacted by the acquisition. So, again, hard to know. I mean, other people here may have different views on that. I just haven't seen them. I haven't seen most Al-Qaeda leaders or affiliates make much of a big deal over that, or the Gore selling. Yeah.
Quick question. You keep on making mention of the fundraising. Who's the work for? Who's the money?
Sorry, who's the?
Where does the money go?
Where does the money go? Well, it's done through several ways. It's done through informal Hawala networks. In fact, there are good court cases that we can talk openly about with both Zazi and Shahzad, where there was fundraising activity. Actually, in those cases, like Shahzad, the money came from Pakistan to the U.S. via Hawala networks in Massachusetts and Long Island. So money can go both directions through informal networks, as well as by hand be carried out, as well as through banking systems. They've got to be careful on the banking systems, just because those have been much better monitored by the Department of Treasury in particular. But what they've tried to do is use front companies to raise money for what appear to be legitimate causes, and then use that money in legitimate banks, funnel it back to places in, say, the Gulf. All looks like it's legitimate business, and then it's pushed through other ways into radical networks in North Africa or the Levant or South Asia. So it may actually look clean all the way up till pretty far in the process, and then some of it may get pulled out into jihadist networks. So it can be both informal on the Hawala side, or on the formal side using actual banks to move money over continents. And again, in some places we see when it gets into the Levant, it's often carried by hand in some cases. Hard to do that here. Okay, so just to conclude on the Iraq front, again, I would take the NCTC director's comments on AQI's movement back in. Its attack patterns have increased. It's also of growing concern to the U.S. homeland. I noted earlier Syria. Look, this is a big one to watch, I think, especially with nodes. We've got Americans that have gone into Syria now. We have Americans from multiple cities, both urban and rural areas of America, that have gone to Syria to fight. This is a huge magnet for jihadist activity. They are active in controlling key urban areas and rural areas under the name of al-Nusra Front, but do not be deceived. This is not a separate organization. This is an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. They have just been very careful, I think, in trying to publicly distance themselves from the organization, but privately they are an al-Qaeda affiliate, and we've seen their involvement in collection of weapons, funds, and fighters significantly increase, including conventional kinds of weapons, everything from tanks to man-pads. And as you know, one area of definite concern, including for its impact on the U.S. homeland, is Syria has been a notable collector, producer of chemical weapons. So if that regime falls, and I think it probably will, you now have, and we know that groups like al-Nusra have identified where those chemical factories are in Syria. They would like to get their hands on chemical weapons. There is very little U.S. activity in Syria right now, other than providing non-lethal assistance and trying to provide some sort of diplomatic assistance to the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian opposition. But again, all sorts of concerns on the WMD front for the U.S. homeland if some of these chemical weapons get out into non-state actors, especially al-Qaeda. I mean, they have identified, as have we, where the key, say, chemical facilities are located. I can pretty much guarantee you if these organizations attempt to get their hands on them, or if the Assad government falls and these areas become vulnerable, the U.S. will act, as will several others in the region, including the Jordanians and the Turks. But this becomes a race then for acquiring chemical weapons. Again, Very serious implications for the U.S. homeland if you get non-state actors with chemical weapons. This is something that Al-Qaeda has wanted to have for a long time. They've had several individuals over the past decade involved in limited chemical, biological, and even sort of early phases of nuclear production, but most of those programs have been impacted because the individuals have been killed by drone strikes or have been captured. This would be probably their best way of getting it. See, we've seen them raid stockpiles as the Libya government collapsed of surface-to-air missiles, man-pads, and other weapons in Libya. And now Syria is probably the big bet. And again, the fact that we've got Americans now in Syria fighting against the Assad regime is of concern, I think, because of their ability to reach back into the U.S. heartland, to recruit more individuals, and to potentially come back. So Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, again, I've covered them pretty heavily so far. Let me just touch on, again, the direction that this organization is going in North Africa is to take advantage of Arab uprisings, weakened states, and growing Muslim populations in Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and again, to make use of American diaspora populations back in the homeland, because we have a number of diaspora populations, you may not know it, of North Africans living in your areas. So part of it is understanding the diaspora communities living in our local communities, but it's an area they have identified. Now, the U.S. killing of civilians in Algeria, this is the Al Amenas attack. This killed Americans. This was deliberately targeting foreigners, including Americans. And so I would say if you go back to 1998, what we're seeing now is the targeting of things like U.S. consulate and an ambassador in Libya, as we did in '98 with the embassy, targeting American citizens in Algeria. And I would ask this question, because Al-Qaeda has, what has the U.S. response been to the networks involved in Algeria? What is the network in response to the organization that killed the U.S. ambassador in Libya been so far? Virtually nothing. This organization takes this as a sign of, this may not be right, but as a sign of weakness. Again, that may not be a correct interpretation on their side, but I would say what we're seeing is, let's hit the homeland then. The U.S. is not willing to hit us back, just like in 1998 when they had a couple of cruise missile strikes in places like Afghanistan. Time to hit them where it counts. So again, watch that dynamic, I think, as it happens over the next year or two, because this is, again, deliberate targeting of Americans overseas in vulnerable locations with groups that have taken advantage of an Arab Spring. A lot of the weapons used in this were taken from places like Libya, weapons caches in Libya. Same thing in Mali. Weakened regime, had a coup a couple years ago, and Al-Qaeda made a push with other organizations to take greater territory. The U.S. did provide some assistance here, but this was mostly a French enterprise in Mali. Now, I'm just going to end just touching base with Shabab and then give ourselves a couple of minutes to ask Q&A. But I just want to take the Shabab case as a good example to highlight that connection back to U.S. urban and rural areas. Because, again, Al-Qaeda's affiliate here, Al-Shabaab, has been pushed back in southern Somalia with some activity. The Kenyans, the U.S., and others have pushed it back. But what's useful is we still have some Americans involved, but these numbers are actually a little dated. The numbers are higher now. We have terrorist indictments accusing Somali Americans in multiple states for supporting al-Shabaab. There was an investigative report about a year and a half ago by the U.S. House Committee on Homeland Security. It found that al-Shabaab had recruited. Now that number is bigger. Somali Americans from U.S. immigrant communities, some, such as Shua Ahmed, blew himself up, was a suicide bomber. And then we have the possibility at some point of al-Shabaab individuals returning to the U.S. homeland. I'd say at the moment we're not seeing a lot of al-Shabaab plotting against the U.S. homeland, but we're seeing a lot of activity back and forth. Growing knowledge about Somali immigrants, a concern over Somali activity in places like key border points, entry points, populations in places like Phoenix of Somalis that have increasing connections with al-Shabaab in Somalia. Minneapolis has a large population of Somalis. Other places include, again, I said Phoenix earlier, Columbus, San Diego, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and Maine, Denver, Nashville, Lewiston, Cedar Rapids, areas where we've seen Somalis increasingly active in supporting al-Shabaab, in some cases in going to Somalia to conduct activities. So, part of the issue for us, I think, is a better understanding of some of the nuances here of these kinds of communities. Most of their individuals are law-abiding, want nothing other than to live peacefully, don't support extremists. It's a small minority that are involved in some of this activity. But it's important, I think, in understanding some of these issues. Take, for example, the clan and tribal systems in Somalia. Somali society, it's important to understand this from a U.S. Homeland Security standpoint, is organized by clan affiliations, and social structure originated before the arrival of Islam. You have a range of clans, sub-tribes, and tribes. There's been some susceptibility. Now, why is all that important? It's getting a little bit more fine-grained understanding of it becomes important, because then you can see what the clan composition looks like in places like Phoenix. Well, where are their ties? Some of the Darude clan has strong ties to al-Shabaab in Somalia. Members of other tribes may not. But understanding in terms of interviews where these individuals are coming in when they come back to the United States is important. It's important for other reasons, because if you think of asking questions, if someone's claiming to be Somali and they're just coming from Somalia, how did they get through? What part of the country did they visit? If they got into Somalia from the Kenyan border, for example, they basically had to go through Shabaab territory in order to get there. So again, I think what we're talking about is getting a better appreciation of where they went, who they're affiliated with, what their clan distinctions were. If they crossed into Somalia and they're coming back into the U.S., how'd they get there? Red flags if they're coming in through the border with Kenya. Those are just some examples, I think, as we look at how to connect what's going on overseas to back in the U.S. homeland. On law enforcement and intelligence activities, again, when did they arrive in the U.S., state of arrival, parents' names. They're all ways to better understand the clan dynamics and where their families are from in places like Somalia, to get a better understanding of whether they've got connections to radical groups. Let me just make a few concluding remarks. Al-Qaeda, again, this is my perspective. Again, recognizing there are a lot of threats out there, and this is not the only one. But that organization continues to decentralize. It's got a lot of affiliated groups and networks, many of which have networks and diasporas that are active in U.S. urban and metropolitan areas. We know that from collection elements, and we know that these groups are vulnerable in many ways. They are not representative of most of the communities in which they operate. The question, I think, for many of us is, how do we better work with local communities in separating the chaff from the wheat? The vast majority of communities that are law-abiding and peaceful and moderate from those who want to conduct terrorist activity, whether it's the financing, the recruitment, or actually attacks. And as we look at some of these past cases, again, part of this issue is, if you look at the Alexandria 5 here, that was one interesting case where the families did get concerned because the individuals did radicalize and did go to Pakistan. The communities alerted a non-governmental organization who alerted U.S. law enforcement. So we have cases where we do have some community interaction that is alerting us to radical activity and potentially destructive activity. But I think as we look at the state of al-Qaeda today and its impact on the U.S. homeland, I would say, big picture, we're looking at a fourth wave of activity. Not in Afghanistan like it was back in 1998, 99, 2000. Not in Iraq like it was in 2003 as much anymore. Not in Yemen, although it's still in those areas, but a new fourth wave that's geared in particular towards North Africa and the Levant. So I think as we look at what's the connection back to the U.S. homeland from al-Qaeda, it's, first of all, it's a group that has weakened in some areas but expanded in others. It's not dead. It's probably more active, I would say, in more areas than it was 10 years ago. Some of these organizations are not targeting the U.S. Some are. I think it behooves us then to understand our local communities better, because again, the connections here with North Africa, with Syria and Iraq, with the Arabian Peninsula, and with South Asia are very important, because that's what this organization needs to attack us the way they want to attack us right now. I mean, going through the bin Laden documents, it is striking how badly they would like to hit us again. They are focused to some degree on near enemy targets, but we are and will remain the big foreign enemy target.